Today, we have a story that will chill you to the bone. My own wife and son were secretly replacing my life-saving heart medication with sugar pills. They thought I wouldn't notice because I had lost my sense of taste and that I would just quietly pass away. But they didn't know about a crumpled piece of paper in my son's glove box that was about to expose their entire evil plot. First and foremost, I want to give a very special, heartfelt shout out to my wonderful and active subscribers, Sharon from Jamaica, Nikki from South Jersey, and Angela from Nigeria. Your support across oceans and continents means the world. Thank you for being with me. We would love to know from what corners of the world you're watching. Please let us know your city in the comments below. And now, make yourselves comfortable. My name is Walter, and I am 72 years old. My life has been a long and winding road, paved not with asphalt and concrete, but with the grit of shrimp boat decks, the searing heat of factory floors, and the fine choking dust of 100 different construction sites. I come from a generation of men who were taught that the measure of your worth was in the sweat of your brow and the calluses on your hands. I had a good mind, a mind that, in a different world, might have earned me a comfortable life as a white-collar man in a quiet, air-conditioned office. I'd managed to get a decent education in the early 80s, a small miracle in itself. But the world wasn't always kind to men who looked like me, no matter what their degree said. The comfortable office jobs never seemed to materialize. So I did what I had to do. I worked. I took the dangerous jobs, the ones no one else wanted. I spent years on shrimp boats out in the Gulf, my body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in my bones. I worked in the factories where the air was thick with chemicals and the noise was a constant deafening roar. I did it all without complaint. Because that work, that hard, body-breaking labor, was for them, for my wife Brenda and my son Michael. It was the price I paid to give them a life of comfort and security that I had never known. That life of hard labor had left its mark. It had given me a whole bouquet of ailments, as the doctors like to call it. A heart that beat to its own unsteady rhythm. Blood pressure that was a constant simmering threat. And a case of diabetes that required a strict daily regimen of medication. But in exchange for my health, the work had given me something else, a small fortune. I had been careful, investing what I could, saving every spare dollar. I had amassed enough to finally, at the age of 70, put down my tools and look forward to a quiet, peaceful retirement, a time to finally enjoy the fruits of my labor with my wife and my grandchildren. I had done my duty. I had earned my rest, or so I believed. Fate, it seems, had one last cruel joke to play. The pandemic that swept the world, the virus that so many of us remember with a shudder, had left me with a strange, lingering parting gift. It had stolen my sense of taste and smell. Food had become a simple matter of texture and fuel. The subtle, joyful flavors of my wife's cooking a distant, faded memory. It was a small loss, I told myself, in the grand scheme of things. I had not realized at the time that it was this very loss that would make me vulnerable to the most intimate and unthinkable form of betrayal. The story truly begins with the arrival of my grandson Leo. He is 6 years old, a whirlwind of pure, joyful energy and the undisputed light of my life. He was spending the afternoon with us, and as I sat in my armchair reading the paper, he came running up to me, his eyes wide with a child's desperate, urgent need for a treat. "Grandpa," he said, tugging on my sleeve, "can you get me some of the good candy? The little sweet ones? Grandma always keeps them on the top shelf in the pantry. The one she says is for her special recipes." I chuckled, folding my newspaper. My wife, Brenda, was out for her weekly grocery run. "All right, little man," I said, pushing myself up from the chair, my joints protesting. "Let's see if we can't find Grandma's secret stash." I walked into the pantry, a small, well-organized space that was my wife's domain. On the very top shelf, just as Leo had said, was a large, decorative tin where she kept her baking sugars and apparently a secret supply of candy. I pulled over the small step stool, my movements slow and careful, and climbed up. I opened the tin, and there, nestled amongst bags of powdered sugar and sprinkles, was a small, familiar-looking box. It was a box of sugar candies, the kind that are pressed into tiny pill-like shapes, designed to look like medication for children to play with. But my blood ran cold. They weren't just designed to look like medication. They were identical, absolutely, one-to-one, identical to the small, white, chalky pills I took every morning for my diabetes. The shape, the size, the small scored line down the middle. They were a perfect match. I stood there on the step stool in the quiet, dim light of the pantry, the small, unassuming box of candy pills clutched in my hand. My mind, a thing that had once been trained to assess threats in a split second, seemed to grind to a halt. 1,000 innocent explanations tried to rush into the void, a desperate army of rationalizations attempting to defend a lifetime of trust. "It's just a coincidence," the first voice said. "A novelty candy. Brenda probably bought it for Leo as a gag, a way for him to play Grandpa." It was a flimsy defense, but one I clung to with a desperate hope. I closed the decorative tin, climbed down from the stool, and walked back into the living room, my face a carefully constructed mask of normalcy. "Here you go, little man," I said to my grandson, my voice sounding distant and strange in my own ears. I shook a few of the tiny white chalky pills into his outstretched palm. "Don't tell Grandma we got into her secret stash." Leo giggled, popping the candies into his mouth with the simple, uncomplicated joy of a child. He chewed them happily. They were, it seemed, just candy. I watched him, and a small part of the icy dread in my gut began to recede. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. But the doubt, once planted, was a stubborn and invasive weed. After Leo's mother came to pick him up, and the house was once again filled with its familiar, heavy silence, I found myself drawn to the weekly pill organizer that sat on our kitchen counter. It was a plastic box with 7 little compartments, one for each day of the week, each filled with the cocktail of medications that kept my aging body running. Brenda, in what I had always perceived as an act of loving care, would fill it for me every Sunday, her voice a cheerful, nagging reminder. "Now, Wally, you make sure you take these every day. I don't want you forgetting." My hand trembled slightly as I flipped open the compartment for Tuesday. Inside were the 3 pills I was supposed to take with my dinner. A large oblong one for my blood pressure, a small yellow one for my heart, and the small, white, chalky pill for my diabetes. I picked up the diabetes pill, my heart beginning to hammer a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I walked back to the pantry, retrieved a box of candy, and shook one out into my other palm. I stood there, under the bright, unforgiving light of the kitchen, and I compared them. In my left hand was my medication, the pill that was supposed to be managing my blood sugar, the pill that stood between me and blindness, nerve damage, or a diabetic coma. In my right hand was the candy my grandson had just been happily chewing. They were not similar. They were not close. They were absolutely, unequivocally, and terrifyingly identical. The same size to the millimeter, the same chalky matte texture, the same precise scored line down the middle, designed to be split in half. I rolled them between my thumb and forefinger. They felt the same. The only possible way to tell them apart, I knew with a sudden, sickening certainty, would be by taste. The one sense that the virus had stolen from me. The one sense I no longer possessed. The coincidence was now too great. The symmetry of it too perfect. Too cruel. My mind, the mind of a man who had spent his life on dangerous jobs, where you learn to trust your gut or end up dead, needed more than just a visual match. I needed proof. I needed to be certain before I allowed my heart to accept the monstrous, unthinkable truth. I performed a small, silent, scientific experiment there in the quiet of my kitchen. I took 3 clean glasses from the cupboard. Into the first glass, I dropped the pill from my daily organizer. Into the second, I dropped the candy from the box in the pantry. Then, I went to the medicine cabinet in my bathroom. In the very back, behind a bottle of old aftershave, was an old, nearly empty prescription bottle of my actual pharmacy-issued diabetes medication. From months ago, before Brenda had taken over the task of managing my pills. I took one of the real pills and dropped it into the third glass. I filled each glass with a bit of warm water, and I watched. The results were swift, clear, and utterly devastating. The pill in the first glass, my daily medication, fizzed slightly and dissolved in under a minute, leaving behind nothing but clear, slightly sweetened water. The candy in the second glass did the exact same thing. But the pill in the third glass, the real medication from the pharmacy, behaved differently. It dissolved slowly, reluctantly, breaking down into a fine, cloudy sediment that settled at the bottom of the glass, a milky, medicinal residue. The experiment was over. The verdict was in. For weeks, for months, for a period of time I couldn't even begin to calculate. My wife, the woman I had shared a bed with for 50 years, had been replacing my life-saving medication with children's candy. The strange, dizzy spells I'd had, the profound waves of fatigue I had blamed on my heart condition, the blurry vision I had attributed to old age, it was all now cast in a new, terrifying light. These were not the symptoms of a managed illness. They were the symptoms of a slow, deliberate, and systematic poisoning by neglect. I was still standing there, staring at the 3 glasses, at the clear, undeniable proof of my wife's treachery, when I heard the familiar sound of her car pulling into the garage. A surge of pure, primal adrenaline, an old forgotten feeling from a lifetime of facing down danger, shot through me. My training took over. Remain calm. Observe. Do not reveal your position. I moved with the speed I didn't know I still possessed, dumping the contents of the glasses down the sink, rinsing them and placing them back in the cupboard. I shoved the old prescription bottle deep into my pocket and put the candy box back on the top shelf of the pantry. I was sitting in my armchair, the newspaper held in my trembling hands, just as she walked through the door. She was a picture of domestic normalcy, her arms laden with grocery bags, her face cheerful. "Hi, honey," she called out, her voice a bright, familiar song that now sounded like a funeral dirge. "How was your day?" Did you remember to take your afternoon medicine? The question, so casual, so caring on the surface, was a monstrous, twisted thing. Yes, dear, I managed to say, my voice a dry, scratchy thing. Just took it a little while ago. She came over and kissed me on the cheek, her lips cool against my skin. You look a little pale, Wally, she said, her brow furrowed with a look of perfect, wifely concern. Are you feeling all right? I needed to get out. I needed air. I needed to escape the suffocating presence of this stranger who was my wife before I broke, before I revealed the terrible knowledge that was now burning a hole in my soul. I'm fine, I lied. Just a little tired. I think I just need to get some fresh air. Clear my head. I looked at her, my expression one of weary, believable vulnerability. Brenda, could you give me the keys to Michael's car? I just feel like a short drive. Our son, Michael, and his wife were on a 2-week vacation in Mexico. As always, they had left their new, expensive car in our garage, where it was safe, rather than in the long-term parking at the airport. Of course, honey, she said, her face full of sympathy for a tired, ailing husband. She retrieved the keys from the hook by the door and placed them in my hand. Don't be too long. Dinner will be ready in an hour. I walked out of the house, my mind a maelstrom of betrayal and horror, leaving the woman who was trying to kill me smiling and humming to herself as she began to put away the groceries. Getting into my son Michael's car was like stepping into a different world. It was a late model sedan, all polished chrome, and the new car smell of leather and ambition. It was a world away from my own trusty 20-year-old pickup truck, a vehicle of pure function, its cab forever smelling faintly of sawdust and honest labor. This car was a symbol of the life I had broken my back to provide for him, a life of comfort and ease that I had never known myself. As I pulled out of the driveway and onto the street, the smooth, silent power of the engine felt like a mockery of the violent, chaotic storm that was raging inside my own heart. I drove with no destination. I just drove. The familiar streets of my neighborhood, the houses and trees I had seen every day for 50 years, now looked alien and menacing, as if I were seeing them for the first time through the eyes of a stranger. Every passing car seemed to hold a happy couple, every front yard a laughing family, and each scene of domestic bliss was a fresh, sharp twist of the knife in my gut. My mind, a place I had always taken pride in for its order and its logic, was a maelstrom of unanswerable questions and agonizing memories. Why? The word was a relentless drumbeat against the inside of my skull. Why would she do this? I sifted through a half-century of memories with Brenda, searching for a clue, a sign, a hint of the monster that had apparently been living beside me all along. I saw her as a young bride, full of life and laughter. I saw her as a young mother, her face soft with a fierce, protective love for our son. I saw her holding my hand at my own mother's funeral. Had it all been a lie? A 50-year performance? Or had she changed? Had the woman I married been slowly, imperceptibly, eroded away by some secret bitterness, some hidden resentment I had been too blind, too trusting, too foolish to see? The betrayal wasn't just the sugar pills. It was the retroactive poisoning of every single memory I held dear. Every shared meal, every anniversary, every quiet evening spent together was now tainted, suspect, a potential scene in a long and patient crime. The trust that had been the absolute bedrock of my entire existence had been pulverized, and I was in a terrifying, weightless free fall, with nothing to hold on to. The pressure in my chest grew, a tight, suffocating band of pure, undiluted anguish. I felt a desperate, primal urge for something, anything, to quiet the screaming in my head, to give me a single moment of respite. I pulled the car over onto a deserted side street, the industrial landscape of warehouses and chain-link fences a perfect match for the desolation in my own soul. And then, a craving I had not felt in 30 years, a ghost I thought I had vanquished long ago, rose from its grave. I wanted a cigarette. The shame of the desire was immediate and profound. I had quit smoking on the day Michael was born, a solemn promise I had made to Eleanor as I held my newborn son in my arms. For 35 years, I had kept that promise. But the man who had made that promise was a man who believed in his wife, a man who felt safe in his own home. That man was gone. My son is a heavy smoker, I muttered to myself, the words a pathetic, desperate justification. The thought that I might find a pack of cigarettes in his car, that I might use his own vice as a crutch for the pain his family had inflicted, was a bitter, twisted irony. I leaned over and opened the glove box, a frantic, fumbling search for a moment's peace. The compartment was a mess, a chaotic jumble of old gas receipts, dried up pens, fast food napkins, and the user's manual for the car. It was a small, perfect reflection of my son's own careless, disorganized approach to life. And there, tucked in the back, was a slightly crushed, half-empty pack of his preferred brand. My hands trembled as I pulled out a cigarette and found the cheap plastic lighter beside it. The ritual felt both alien and intimately familiar. The click of the lighter, the flare of the small dancing flame, the first harsh, acrid intake of smoke. It burned my lungs, a raw, punishing sensation after 3 decades of clean air, and I coughed, my body convulsing. But then, the nicotine hit my bloodstream, and with it came a wave of a calm so profound, so blessedly quiet, that for a moment, the screaming in my head stopped. I sat there, in my son's car on a deserted street, and I smoked. A guilty, heartbroken old man breaking a sacred vow in a desperate search for a moment's oblivion. When the cigarette was down to the filter, the guilt returned, mingling with the shame. I carefully stubbed it out in a discarded coffee cup. I took the pack, intending to put it back in the glove box to hide the evidence of my own weakness. And that's when I saw it, a single, carelessly crumpled piece of paper, shoved in the back of the compartment, clearly intended to be thrown away, forgotten. I picked it up, my first instinct simply to clean up my son's mess, to restore some small semblance of order. I was a man tidying up the debris of his own life. I idly, almost unconsciously, began to uncrumple the paper. I flattened it out against the passenger seat. I saw the official letterhead of a life insurance company. I saw my own name, Walter Freeman, listed as the insured party. And I saw the date the policy had been updated, just 3 weeks ago. My heart, the one they were so patiently and methodically trying to stop, gave a single, hard, and painful thud against my ribs. The initial agonizing question of why was about to be answered. And I knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that the truth would be far uglier than anything I could have ever imagined. My fingers, clumsy with a mixture of dread and the lingering tremor from the cigarette, carefully smoothed the crumpled paper against the leather of the passenger seat. The dim, intermittent glow of a passing streetlight illuminated the document. It was not a simple piece of trash. It was a formal, multi-page summary from a major life insurance company, the kind of sterile, bureaucratic document that spells out the financial consequences of a human life. And the name, listed in cold, bold type at the top of the page under the heading Insured, was my own, Walter Freeman. I scanned the page, my mind, the one they thought was clouded and failing, suddenly sharp, with a terrifying, laser-like focus. The policy had been taken out over 20 years ago, a standard part of the financial planning Eleanor and I had done when Michael was still in college. But this was an updated summary, printed just 3 weeks ago. The beneficiaries were listed clearly. Brenda Freeman, my wife, at 50%, and Michael Freeman, my son, at 50%. And then I saw the payout amount, the death benefit, a number so large, so grotesquely out of proportion with the quiet, modest life we lived, that for a moment I could not breathe. $2 million. My life, it seemed, was worth a great deal more to my family in death than it ever had been in life. The cold, ugly tendrils of a monstrous logic began to snake their way into my mind. This was not about my pension. It was not about the house. It was about a massive, life-changing jackpot, and I was the ticket they were trying to cash in. But the final, most damning piece of the puzzle was not on the summary itself. Stapled clumsily to the back was a flimsy, printed-out copy of an email. It was from the insurance agent, a man named Bill, addressed to my son, Michael. The subject line was policy clarification. The body of the email was short and chillingly direct. I read the words, and the last lingering vestiges of the man I used to be, the loving husband, the trusting father, died in the dim, claustrophobic silence of my son's car. Michael, the email read, just confirming our conversation from this morning. As we discussed, the accidental death clause on your father's policy is robust. However, please be advised that the policy contains a standard exclusion clause and will be considered null and void if the death is found to be a direct result of willful non-compliance with prescribed medical treatment for his known pre-existing conditions, i.e., his diabetes and hypertension. A death certificate listing diabetic ketoacidosis as the cause of death, for example, would almost certainly trigger a full investigation and non-payment. However, as I mentioned, a sudden acute cardiac event, such as a major heart attack or a stroke, which, as you know, are often tragic, but not uncommon complications of unmanaged long-term diabetes and high blood pressure, would almost certainly be covered in full. Let me know if you have any further questions. I let the paper fall from my hand. The puzzle was complete. Every piece now fit together with a sickening, perfect precision. The sugar pills. It was never about a slow, gentle death from high blood sugar. That would have voided the policy. The plan was far more diabolical, more sophisticated. The sugar pills were the weapon, designed to silently, systematically, and catastrophically destabilize my body, to send my blood pressure soaring, to ravage my system with unregulated glucose, all in the service of creating the perfect, medically plausible conditions for a massive policy honoring heart attack or stroke. They were not just waiting for me to die. They were methodically, patiently, and lovingly setting the stage for a natural cardiac event that would make them millionaires. A lifetime of memories suddenly, violently reframed themselves in my mind. Brenda's recent obsessive insistence on managing my medications, her theatrical concern over my pill box, It wasn't an act of love. It was an act of absolute, meticulous control over the murder weapon. My son's strange, morbid questions over the past few months. Dad, have you got your will sorted out? Do you have a good life insurance policy? It wasn't the responsible concern of a loving son. It was an act of financial reconnaissance, their casual, almost bored dismissal of my recent dizzy spells, their utter lack of concern when I complained of feeling unwell. They weren't ignoring my symptoms. They were monitoring them, watching their evil, patient work take effect, waiting for the very heart in my chest to finally explode. The grief I had felt just moments before, the profound human pain of a husband and father betrayed, was burned away, replaced by something far colder, far harder. It was the cold, dispassionate fury of a soldier who has just discovered the enemy is not at the gates, but has been living inside the wire, wearing a friendly uniform for years. My family, my wife, my son had become the enemy, and I, a man who had thought his wars were long over, was now in a fight for my very life. I carefully, precisely, folded the crumpled insurance document and the damning email and placed them securely in my breast pocket. This was my ammunition. This was the proof that would be my shield and my sword. I started the car. The engine, once a symbol of a life I could never have, now felt like a tool, an asset in my new campaign. I was no longer driving aimlessly, a lost old man adrift in a sea of sorrow. I had a mission. I had a purpose. The user's original text flashed in my mind, a line of perfect, chilling clarity. Now I know what to do. I was no longer a victim waiting to be executed. I was a soldier on a reconnaissance mission, and I was heading back to base to formulate my plan of attack. I would go back to the house. I would play the part of the frail, oblivious old man they believed me to be. I would eat their food. I would sleep under their roof, and I would smile at their faces, all while gathering the intelligence I needed to dismantle their entire monstrous world. I pulled my son's car back into the garage, the smooth, silent purr of the engine, a stark contrast to the loud, grinding gears of my own mind. I sat for a moment in the darkness, the crumpled insurance policy, a hot, sharp-edged stone in my pocket. The man who had driven away from this house an hour ago was a shattered, grieving victim, lost in a fog of confusion and pain. The man who was about to walk back inside was someone entirely different. The grief had not vanished, but it had been compressed into a small, hard, diamond-like core of purpose. The soldier had taken command. My mission was no longer to understand the betrayal. It was to survive it, document it, and, when the time was right, to neutralize the threat. I composed my face, letting the hard lines of my resolve soften, forcing the cold fury from my eyes, and replacing it with the familiar, weary resignation they expected to see. I practiced a slight tremor in my hand as I reached for the door handle. I was reassuming my cover, the role of a frail, slightly confused old man, a part I now understood I had been unknowingly playing for months. When I walked back into the kitchen, Brenda was at the stove, humming a cheerful tune as she stirred a pot of something that smelled delicious. The sheer, breathtaking domesticity of the scene, the casual normalcy of it, was the most monstrous part of all. She was preparing a meal for a man whose slow, agonizing death she was actively, patiently engineering. "There you are, Wally," she said, turning to me with a bright, concerned smile. I was starting to worry. "Did the drive help you clear your head? You feeling any better?" Her question was a probe, a gentle, loving reconnaissance mission to assess my state of mind and body. She was a medic on the battlefield, checking the vital signs of her own victim. A little, I lied, my voice a convincing, gravelly whisper. I allowed a slight waver to enter it, just a bit of a headache. I think you're right, Brenda. I just need to rest. I was no longer just her husband. I was a counterintelligence operative, and I was feeding her the disinformation she wanted to hear. My perceived weakness was now my greatest strength. The next morning, my number one priority was survival. The sugar pills in my weekly organizer were a clear and present danger, a daily dose of poison that I could no longer afford to ingest. I needed my real medication, and I needed to acquire it without raising any suspicion. I waited until after breakfast, after I had dutifully swallowed the chalky, sweet placebo she had placed beside my orange juice. Brenda, I said, standing up slowly from the kitchen table, I think I'm going to head over to the VFW post for a few hours. Old Henderson called last night, wants to get a game of checkers in. It'll do me good to get out of the house. It was a perfect excuse. My weekly visits to the Veterans of Foreign Wars post were a long-standing part of my routine, a familiar and unremarkable habit. She readily agreed, her face a mask of wifely encouragement. That's a wonderful idea, honey, she said. You go and have fun with your friends. Don't you worry about a thing here. But I did not drive to the VFW post. I drove in the opposite direction, to a neighboring town 20 miles away, a place where no one knew my face. I walked into a small, independent pharmacy, a place a world away from the big chain drugstore, where my wife had my prescriptions filled. I approached the counter, my old empty prescription bottle for my diabetes medication in my hand, my heart pounding with the nervous energy of a spy on a covert mission. I explained my situation to the pharmacist, a kind-faced woman with intelligent eyes. I told her I was visiting from out of town and had foolishly forgotten my medication. I told her my doctor's office was closed and that I was in desperate need of an emergency refill to get me through the weekend. The lies, now in the service of my own survival, came easily to my lips. She listened patiently, made a brief phone call to verify the prescription, and then, with a sympathetic smile, she filled it. The moment she handed me that small plastic bottle of real, life-saving pills was a victory more profound than any I had experienced on a real battlefield. I paid in cash, a $100 bill from the emergency stash I kept hidden in my wallet, leaving no paper trail, no insurance record that could be traced. I drove back to my own neighborhood and parked my truck a few blocks away, walking the final distance to my house to ensure no one saw me arrive. Back inside, I executed the next phase of my plan. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and with the steady, precise hands of a demolitions expert, I performed the switch. I carefully emptied the 2 remaining sugar pills from the Tuesday compartment of my weekly organizer and flushed them down the toilet. In their place, I put 2 of the real potent pills from the new bottle. I then wrapped the new bottle in an old sock and buried it deep in the bottom of my old Army footlocker in the back of my closet, a place I knew my wife never looked. The trap was now disarmed. My physical survival, for the time being, was secure. Now it was time to move to the next phase of the operation, gathering new intelligence. The insurance policy was the motive, a powerful and damning piece of evidence. But I wanted more. I wanted to hear it in their own words. I needed to capture their conspiracy on tape, to have an undeniable record of their intent that would stand up in any court, be it legal or familial. That afternoon, while Brenda was out at the grocery store, the same store where she had likely bought the candy pills, I sat at my desk and went online. I was not a man of high technology, but I was a man who understood strategy. I didn't need complex video systems. I needed something simple, effective, and discreet. I found what I was looking for on a website for private investigators. A tiny voice-activated audio recorder, no bigger than a sugar cube, with a battery that would last for a week. I paid for it with my own credit card and arranged for it to be delivered not to my house, but to a secure post office box I had just opened under my own name. The device arrived 2 days later. That night, after Brenda and I had finished our quiet, tense dinner, after she had gone to a room to watch her television shows and I had retreated to my study, I made my final move. I took the tiny, innocuous-looking device and walked into the living room. It was their command center, the place they would sit together in the evenings, their voices low as they discussed their plans, believing I was out of earshot. I found the perfect spot, a small dark recess on the underside of the heavy oak coffee table, right between the two worn armchairs where they always sat. With a small piece of black electrical tape, I secured the listening post. It was invisible. It was active. My quiet, domestic counterinsurgency had officially begun. The days that followed the planting of the audio recorder were a strange and terrible exercise in duality. On the surface, I was a man in decline. I would move through the house with a deliberate slowness, my hands sometimes shaking as I lifted my coffee cup. I would occasionally feign a dizzy spell, sitting down heavily in my armchair and pressing a hand to my chest, a small, theatrical performance for an audience of two. I was giving them what they wanted to see, a frail old man, his health teetering on the brink, his body slowly succumbing to the patient, poisonous work of their sugar pills. My weakness was my greatest weapon, a carefully constructed camouflage that I hoped would lull them into a false sense of security, encouraging them to speak freely in what they believed was the privacy of their own conspiracy. Beneath this veneer of frailty, however, a different man was at work, a soldier. Every night, after I had made a show of going to bed early, I would lie in the darkness of my room, my door slightly ajar, and I would listen. I would listen to the low, indistinct murmur of their voices from the living room, the rise and fall of their conversation as they watched television. And every morning, before Brenda had woken up, I would slip into the living room in the pre-dawn quiet, my movements as silent and practiced as a cat burglar's, and I would retrieve the tiny, powerful listening device from its hiding place beneath the coffee table. The first 2 nights of surveillance yielded nothing but frustration. I would retreat to my study, the one room in the house that was still truly mine, and listen through a pair of old headphones as I downloaded the audio file to my laptop. The recordings were filled with the mundane, irritating chatter of their shared life. Arguments about what to watch on television, complaints about the price of gasoline, their shared, lazy dreams of a life of ease. There was no mention of me, no discussion of their plot. A cold flicker of the old self-doubt returned. Was I wrong? Had I misinterpreted everything? Was I just a paranoid old man, driven mad by a profound and unthinkable coincidence? The truth, when it finally came, was more brutal and more damning than anything I could have ever prepared myself for. It was on the third night's recording. I sat in my study, the headphones pressed tight against my ears, and I listened as the voices of my wife and my son casually, calmly, and meticulously planned my death. The conversation began with Brenda's voice, sharp and impatient. "It's not working fast enough, Michael," she'd said, the sound of her knitting needles, a soft, rhythmic clicking in the background. "It's been months. He's still walking around. Did you see him today? He almost looked better, clearer. Are you sure those candies are working?" Then my son's voice, a reedy, whiny thing, full of a weak and spineless anxiety. "I don't know, Mom," he'd replied. "The box says they're pure sugar. Maybe we should stop. This feels wrong." "He's my dad." Brenda's knitting needles had stopped. The silence was heavy for a moment, and then her voice came low and venomous, a snake uncoiling in the dark. "Don't you dare go soft on me now, Michael. It is far too late to stop. Or have you forgotten about the money we owe? Have you forgotten the phone calls? Do you want those people showing up here at our home? This is our only way out. That $2 million insurance policy is our ticket to a new life. We just need him to have his little event. The doctors all said his heart is a ticking time bomb anyway. We're just helping the clock tick a little faster." I felt the air leave my lungs. A cold, heavy pressure settled in my chest. She had just named the price of my life, $2 million. Michael had whimpered. "But what if they investigate?" "Investigate what?" Brenda had scoffed. "That an old man with a bad heart, high blood pressure, and uncontrolled diabetes had a heart attack. That is the most natural thing in the world, Michael. It's a tragedy, not a crime. All we have to do is be patient." She had then added a detail that was a new and special kind of evil. "I've been adding a little extra corn syrup to his iced tea every afternoon, just to keep his blood sugar nice and high. Every little bit helps." I listened, my body rigid, as they began to plan the life they would live after I was gone. They spoke of selling my house, this house, the house I had filled with a lifetime of love and memories. "First thing we do is sell this depressing old mausoleum," Brenda had said with a laugh. "We'll buy a beautiful place in Florida, right on the water. You deserve a life of ease, baby. No more work, just sunshine." I sat there in the dark silence of my study, the headphones still pressed against my ears, and I listened to the recording again and again. The sound of their voices, so familiar, so intimate, now stripped of all pretense, revealing the monstrous, greedy, and utterly alien souls that lay beneath. The heartbreak was a physical thing, a crushing weight that threatened to break me. But beneath the heartbreak, the soldier in me was taking notes. I now had everything I needed: the motive, a $2 million insurance policy; the method, a systematic, deliberate destabilization of my diabetes; and now the irrefutable, undeniable proof of their intent, captured in their own damning words. The grief and the anger began to coalesce, to compress themselves into a single, cold, and diamond-hard point of strategic clarity. I knew I could not simply go to the police. A public, messy trial would be a circus. It would destroy my grandson's life, and it would be a final, public stain on the family name I had tried so hard to build. No, this was a private war, and it required a private solution. I would be the judge. I would be the jury, and I would be the one to deliver the final, inescapable sentence. I knew what I had to do. I would call a final family dinner. The trap was baited. The evidence was secured. The final act of this long and terrible war was about to begin. The day I chose for the final confrontation was a Sunday. It was, for 35 years, our traditional family day, a day that had once been filled with the comfortable, sacred rituals of a shared life. Now, I would use that tradition as the stage for the final act of our family's tragedy. I spent the morning in a state of cold, methodical calm. My grief and my rage had been burned away in the crucible of the last week, leaving behind only the hard, unyielding steel of my purpose. I was a soldier, preparing for a final, decisive engagement, and I would leave nothing to chance. I announced my plan at breakfast, my voice a marvel of cheerful, elderly benevolence. "Brenda Michael," I said, looking up from my newspaper. "I've been feeling so much better these past few days. I think your excellent care is finally working." I saw them exchange a small, triumphant glance. "To thank you both," I continued, "I would like to cook dinner for us tonight. A special thank you meal." The suggestion was so out of character, so contrary to the role of the frail, dependent invalid I had been playing, that it momentarily stunned them. Cooking was Brenda's domain, a territory she ruled with an iron fist. My offer was a quiet, subtle seizure of power, but they, in their arrogance, did not see it that way. They saw it as a sign of my improving, docile mood, a sign that their plan was progressing beautifully. "Why, Walter, that's a wonderful idea," Brenda said, her voice dripping with a false, patronizing sweetness. "But are you sure you're up to it?" "I insist," I said with a firm, gentle smile. "It's the least I can do." I spent the day preparing the meal. I did not cook one of Brenda's complicated, fussy recipes. I cooked a simple, hearty meal from my army days: a thick beef stew, crusty bread, a simple green salad. It was the food of soldiers, honest and without pretense. The act of cooking, of moving through my own kitchen with a sense of ownership and purpose, was a deeply satisfying experience. I was no longer a passive recipient of their tainted care. I was the commander of this space, and I was preparing the last supper for my own betrayers. As we sat down to dinner that evening, the atmosphere was thick with a strange, surreal quality. Brenda and Michael were practically giddy, their conversation full of a forced, cheerful chatter. They praised my stew with an effusive, exaggerated enthusiasm. They were acting like heirs apparent, two people on the verge of a massive windfall, graciously playing along with the whims of a doddering old man whose time was nearly up. I let them talk. I played my part, the grateful, slightly confused patriarch, nodding and smiling at their stories. I guided the conversation with a subtle, strategic hand, leading them down the path I had prepared. "You know," I said, feigning a moment of thoughtful reflection, "feeling so poorly lately has really made me think about the future, about making sure you two are taken care of when I'm gone." I saw a flicker of raw, predatory greed in their eyes, a look they quickly tried to conceal with expressions of sorrowful concern. "Oh, don't talk like that, Dad," Michael said, his voice thick with a fake emotion that was almost impressive in its dishonesty. "No, it's important," I insisted. "That life insurance policy we have, Brenda. I trust it's all in order? Everything is up to date?" "Of course, Wally. Don't you worry about a thing," she said, patting my hand, her touch feeling like the cold, dry skin of a snake. "It's all taken care of." "Good," I said. "I'm so glad to hear it." We finished the meal in a comfortable silence. They were relaxed, confident, their victory so close they could taste it. After the plates were cleared, I turned to them, my expression one of final, somber seriousness. "I'm glad we had this talk," I said, "because I also have some things that are now in order." I stood up and walked to the sideboard. I returned to the table, and with a steady hand, I placed 3 items in the center, arranging them with a soldier's precision. First, the small, unassuming box of children's candy pills I had found in the pantry. Second, a crisp, clean, unfolded copy of the $2 million insurance policy and the agent's damning email. And third, a small, black digital audio player. I watched as their eyes fell upon the items. I saw their cheerful, confident expressions begin to falter. A wave of confused, dawning horror began to creep across their faces as they recognized the artifacts of their own conspiracy, now laid out before them like evidence in a courtroom. I sat back down in my chair. "Let's review the case, shall we?" I began, my voice as cold and as calm as a judge's gavel. I pointed to the first item, Exhibit A, the medication you have been so lovingly providing me, Brenda. An excellent counterfeit, so identical to the real thing, it took me a while to figure it out. I then tapped the insurance policy. Exhibit B, the motive, the $2 million reason for the sugar pills. A brilliant plan, really. Induce a cardiac event that would be seen as a natural complication of my pre-existing conditions. Very clean, very clever. Brenda finally found her voice, a weak, sputtering thing. "Walter, this is insane. You're confused. You're not well." I held up a hand, silencing her. "And finally," I said, my gaze fixed on her, "since I know my memory isn't what it used to be, and since you both seem to believe I am in a state of confusion, I decided it was best to get a second opinion. So I made a recording, so we could all be perfectly clear on the facts." And with that, I pressed the play button on the small black device. The small black digital audio player sat in the center of the dining room table like a dark, malevolent heart. I pressed the play button, and the silence of the room was suddenly filled with the ghostly tinny sound of my wife's and my son's own voices, a recording of their soul's deepest, ugliest truths. I watched them as they were forced to listen to their own conspiracy, and it was a study in 2 different kinds of moral collapse. Michael, my son, simply disintegrated as he heard his own weak, whiny protests being systematically dismantled by his mother's cold, manipulative logic. His face crumbled. He buried his head in his hands, his body shaking with the silent, racking sobs of a man being forced to confront the full, pathetic measure of his own cowardice. He was not just hearing a conversation, he was witnessing his own soul's damnation, and the sound was more than he could bear. Brenda, on the other hand, fought it, as her own voice filled the room, so full of a casual, chilling cruelty. His heart is a ticking time bomb anyway. We're just helping the clock tick a little faster. Her face went through a rapid, desperate series of transformations. First, a flash of pure animal panic. Then, a surge of furious, indignant denial, her eyes darting towards me as if I were a magician performing a cheap trick. She even made a move, a half-formed lunge across the table to grab the device. But the cold, unyielding look in my eyes stopped her dead. Finally, as the recording played on, as her own voice cheerfully detailed her plan to buy a house in Florida with my insurance money, all the fight went out of her. Her face went slack, her body slumped in her chair, a puppet whose strings had just been decisively and permanently cut. The recording ended. The final damning words faded, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any sound. The evidence had been presented. The case was closed. I let the silence sit for a long, heavy moment before I spoke. When I did, my voice was not filled with rage or with triumph. It was the calm, dispassionate voice of a judge delivering a final, unavoidable sentence. I looked first at the woman who had been my wife for 50 years. The police would call this conspiracy to commit attempted murder, Brenda, I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. I call it the most profound and unforgivable betrayal a human being can commit. But you will not go to prison. I will not have my grandson, Leo, visit his grandmother behind a pane of plexiglass. I will not have the Freeman name dragged through the mud of a public trial. You will not be judged by the state. You will be judged by me. And my judgment is this: your life, as you have known it, is over. I slid a document across the table, a document my lawyer had prepared for me that week. This is a divorce settlement. It is not a negotiation. It grants you the absolute bare legal minimum required by the state of Georgia, and not a single penny more. You will be out of this house by the end of the week. You will take your car, your clothes, and nothing else. Is that understood? She just stared at me, her face a blank mask of ruin, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then I turned to my son. This was the harder part. This was the wound that would never truly heal. And you, Michael, I said, my voice thick with a sorrow so deep it felt like it was being dredged up from the bottom of my soul. You are my son, and some small, foolish part of me will always love the boy you once were. But the man you have become is a stranger to me. You are a coward, Michael, and your cowardice is not a passive thing. It is an active, destructive force, a weapon that you have allowed your mother to wield against everyone in your life, including me and including yourself. I pushed a second document across the table. This is a copy of my new, legally executed will. You have been completely and irrevocably disinherited. He looked up, his face a mess of tears and snot. Dad, please. But my legacy will not be lost, I continued, my voice unyielding. My entire estate, this house, my savings, my pension, and yes, the $2 million life insurance policy you were so eager to collect will be placed into a trust, not for charity, for Leo, for my grandson. I saw a flicker of desperate, pathetic hope in his eyes and immediately extinguished it. But you will never control it. I will be the sole trustee until my death, and after I am gone, the trust will be managed by my lawyer's firm. Your son will be provided for the rest of his life. He will go to college. He will have a down payment for a house. He will have a future. But you, Michael, will never see a single dime of it. You have proven yourself unworthy of being his guardian. I stood up from the table. Now, I said, my voice taking on the familiar hard edge of a commanding officer, giving a final, non-negotiable order. You will both go and pack your things. You will be out of this house by Friday at noon, and I will never see either of you again. The year that has passed since that night has been the quietest and most peaceful of my life. I sold the big, lonely house, the museum of a life that was now over. I bought a small, manageable home in a quiet community for veterans down on the coast. My days are no longer filled with the tension of a loveless marriage or the anxiety of a slow, creeping death. They are filled with the simple, honest pleasures of a life lived on my own terms. My grandson Leo spends every weekend with me. I am teaching him how to fish, how to play chess, how to be a good and strong and honorable man, the kind of man his own father could never be. His future is secure. That is my only mission now. I lost a wife and I lost a son, but I saved myself. I saved my legacy, and I found a new purpose. As I sit on my small porch, watching the sunset over the ocean, the air clean and salty, I feel a profound sense of a peace I had long forgotten was possible. The battle is over, and the old soldier has, at last, truly come home.